France's political crisis is going from bad to worse. One man thinks he has the answer. The popular economist Gabriel Zucman, who wants to tax the super rich. But is there really a quick fix, or could it backfire? Hello and welcome to Roundtable. I'm Enda Brady. Now, like most Western countries, France has high spending, high debt and high taxes. A 2% wealth tax on fortunes over €100 million is being proposed by a prominent economist. But France's richest man, Bernard Arnault, who owns brands like Christian Dior and Louis Vuitton, says it will be the death of France's economy.
Calls for a wealth tax in France are growing louder as a divided parliament fails to agree on how to improve the country's ever-worsening finances. And its deficit approaches 6% of GDP.
We're tired of paying for others. I've been with the post office for 33 years. I earn a net salary of €1,400 a month, so it's a struggle. We can't make ends meet. So it has to stop, and those who have the money need to pay.
One popular economist, Gabriel Zucman, has popularised a formula for taxing the super rich. He claims a 2% tax on wealth more than €100 million could raise 20 billion in revenue. Yet some economists argue it's likely to raise much less if the ultra-rich leave. And one of those who could be hit with such a tax has already hit back. Owner of Louis Vuitton, Tiffany's and dozens of other luxury brands, billionaire Bernard Arnault has attacked the so-called Zukman tax. In a recent interview, he said, "It is impossible to understand Mr. Zukman's positions if one forgets that he is first and foremost a far-left activist," adding that he cannot believe that the French political forces that govern or have governed the country in the past could lend any credibility to this offensive, which is deadly for the economy. Not all the rich agree. We spoke to a French businessman from the group Patriotic Millionaires who have come out and backed Zukman's proposals.
What it highlights is that actually a lot of the billionaires specifically pay very little tax in France at the moment because they're able to optimize, so to speak, their taxes, and a lot of them, as I said, pay close to almost zero tax.
What would you say to the criticism that wealth taxes just drive away the wealthy from a country's tax base completely?
In France, in the UK, in the US, every time a wealth tax is mentioned, one of the arguments against it seems to be that the rich people will leave. But the factual evidence points to the contrary, is that very little people leave.
Prime Minister Lecornu has, for now, ruled out taxing the super rich as he tries to scrape together support for a 2026 budget, a feat failed by France's two previous prime ministers. But lacking a parliamentary majority, he might be forced to have a rethink if it means getting crucial support from left-wing parties.
Well, let's meet our guests. Joining us from Paris, we have the journalist Elaine Cobbe. In London, we have the legal specialist in private wealth and tax, Hilesh Chavda. And here with me in the studio is the broadcaster Nina dos Santos and the business journalist Ian King. You're all very welcome to Roundtable. Nina, to you first of all. So France's richest man says that this idea, if it's implemented, will kill the French economy. But what is absolutely crippling France is debt.
Yes, that's right. 114% debt to GDP ratio. These are the kind of levels that we remember countries completely panicking about at the height of the Eurozone crisis, 15 years or so ago. And France is a big problem, not just for France, it's a big problem for the whole of the Eurozone. It's one of the biggest economies in the world. And so already it's lost two prime ministers over the last 12, 18 months who've successively been unable to pass austerity budgets to cut about €44 billion off of some of the spending for the main reason that they say France just can't afford to fail and neither can the rest of Europe. Now, obviously, this is an argument that appears to be redundant in the eyes of Bernard Arnault, the head of LVMH, who himself is worth something like 150 billion euros. And so there's a big movement in France that is saying, well, people like him should pony up a bit more money to try and help bring down that deficit rather than ordinary French people who are already contending with the cost of living crisis having to fork out themselves.
Ian, the financial mess in France is so bad, they need something radical, and this is certainly radical.
Well, the most radical thing would be to raise the retirement age, which, of course, President Macron tried to do and failed to do. France has a lower retirement age than most other European countries, certainly most peer economies. And, of course, it spends far too much. I mean, government spending is something like 58% of GDP. So if you're not going to raise taxes, you've got to cut public spending, all other things being equal. And as Nina's just said, it's quite difficult for them to borrow more on the bond markets. But obviously, it's very, very difficult. And I think the reason why this wealth tax is back on the table in France is because ultimately Macron needs to cut a deal with the socialists. He's got to give them something in return. And this is something they would very much like. I don't think it'll work, but that's what's going to be the negotiating point.
Elaine, to you, Zukman, Gabriel Zucman, the economist who came up with this idea, it's certainly out there. I mean, I'm guessing if you're an ordinary working person, you're probably thinking in France, some of these super elites, extremely wealthy people, they need to pay more.
Absolutely. The average French household will pay 50% of taxes in between income tax, VAT, and social charges. Your average French billionaire is only paying 27%, and that is largely because there isn't a real wealth tax here. There's a wealth tax that was brought in a few years ago, but it's purely on real estate, and it's up to 1.3 million euros. Now, that might sound like a lot, but it's only on property, and it includes your own home. So somebody living in Paris, for example, is expected to have it at exactly the same rate as somebody living down the country. Whereas if you're in Paris, 1.3 million will get you a 4-bedroom apartment, which you might want for your family. It's a nice one, but it's not a manor house. It is not something Arnault is living in. And the super wealthy are not paying a wealth tax on their other property, their yachts, their jewelry, paintings, and importantly, any cash assets. And that's something the socialists in particular have been saying, look, it is ridiculous to say we are charging people higher tax just on property, and it's really only hitting the upper middle classes because it's a drop in the ocean when it's only on property for the super rich. And so Zukman was saying, we want to tax their entire wealth. So salaries, dividends, property, things like artworks and yachts, and also to anything over 100 million, which falls at less than 2% of tax.
Hilesh, just come in on what you're hearing dealing with high net worth individuals, as they're called, the super rich. How problematic do you think this is for the very wealthy in France, hearing that this may be adopted?
I mean, I think it's obviously ideally this wouldn't be coming in. They've chosen to live in France for many reasons. A lot of it's lifestyle, education, culture, all of those sorts of things. It might, where their families are. But essentially, a lot of these high net worths are very globally mobile. They will have residences across the world, family members across the world. Their businesses are most probably spread across the world. And they always have a plan at that level of wealth to be globally mobile. So whilst it's not an ideal situation, I think a lot of people will think, well, if I'm going to be taxed here in France, there's going to be a wealth tax. Well, I can just move my residence elsewhere. I can move elsewhere. 2%, isn't a huge amount, as a relative proportion. But I think it's, what it feels like, whether these high net worths feel welcome in France. So I think a lot of them may well think about moving. Whether they do or not, it's a different story.
Thank you, Hilesh. To you, Nina, that phrase globally mobile, these people who have so much money, you mentioned Bernard Arnault, Europe's richest man, 150 billion euros.
By some estimates, some say
could
high,
be more,
155.
When you've got that level of money, he can go where he wants, can't he? I mean, it's not going to affect him.
And let's remember, he nearly did back in 2013 when somebody called Emmanuel Macron under François Hollande's socialist government, if I'm not wrong, was economy minister. And they were talking about a wealth tax then. And Bernard Arnault at one point applied for Belgian citizenship and then said, oh, it had been a great big misunderstanding. He was always going to stay in France. And he's got exponentially richer ever since those days. So people like him have threatened to leave before. As Hilesh was just saying before, as we've learnt from the United Kingdom, where something like 16,500 millionaires are estimated to have left by the end of this year because taxes are rising for them and they're no longer immune to things like inheritance tax. Wealth is portable. And in fact, Italy is now attracting a huge amount of very wealthy people for a flat rate tax of just 200,000 euros. That means that lots of people have headed across that Franco-Italian border to places like Milan. So France may well see an exodus of some of these wealthy people. They won't be coming to the UK anymore because our tax regime is more punitive. They could go to Italy, or they might just threaten to leave and nothing happens again, like Arnault did back in 2013.
Ian, just come in on that Italian situation there. Giorgia Meloni, so her idea, and it's a very, very clever one, you pay a flat rate of 200,000 euros, and we're not interested in what you earn or what you do with your money. Just give us the 200K, and you're very welcome here.
Exactly. They're rolling out the red carpet to the global wealthy, and they're not the only country by any stretch of the imagination. I mean, the UAE, a lot of these countries, by the way, are benefiting from the ending of the non-dom regime here in the United Kingdom. So the UAE is another very popular location. Donald Trump's trying to do it into America. Trump is now issuing, whilst he's also jacking up the cost of visas for foreign workers, if you're very, very wealthy, Trump wants you to come to America, and for a relatively low sum of money, you can get in there and do it. And one of the key reasons that Italy is being so successful, by the way, is because a lot of these people are really, really worried about estates tax, inheritance tax, call it what you will. That was one thing that the non-dom regime protected people from here in the UK. That's been swept away, and it means that if you're a wealthy foreigner and you die here in the UK, your global wealth is now subject to UK inheritance tax at 40%, and that is why an awful lot of people have upped and left.
So Ian, just everything you've been hearing in the money world around London and the city the last few months since Labour have kind of put these tax changes in place, an awful lot of rich people seem to have left. Do you think that will be a worry for the French government? Will they be looking at the UK and thinking, well, hang on, if we do bring in a 2% super tax on the rich, that it'll be like the UK and London will just kind of drain of money?
I think it's an easier sale in France than it is in the UK. Nina's already gone through the fiscal situation. France's debt to GDP ratio is higher than that in the UK. But I think things like wealth taxes play better in France because the wealthy in France have more money. Wealth is relatively concentrated in France. If you take the United Kingdom, it will surprise a lot of people, but wealth is not as concentrated among the elite as it is in most other major peer economies. I think there's only about 3 or 4, the likes of Denmark and the Netherlands, where wealth is less concentrated than it is in the UK. So the UK, and we've always taken a stance against wealth taxes. If you think about taxes were very high in this country in the 1970s when Labour were in power. Dennis Healey, of course, the Chancellor, had to go to the IMF. He looked at a wealth tax then, and he subsequently wrote in his memoirs, we looked at it long and hard, and we could never find a way of doing it that made it worth the political and hassle, people, capital flight and so forth.
Thanks, Ian. Elaine, to you, so 2% on anything worth more than 100 million euros, that's not really going to affect too many French people, let's be honest.
No, it's going to affect 1,800 people. That's the estimated number who would fall into the bracket of the Zukman tax. And it would bring in between 15 and 25 billion euros. Now, put that in comparison to what the former Prime Minister François Bayrou wanted in his austerity budget, which was a 44 billion saving. So it would go a long way to helping cancel that debt. and therefore allow the government a better chance to have fewer austerity measures, to please the unions a bit more, who walked away from the meeting this week saying, well, that didn't help at all. We are going to have another set of strikes on October 2. So it's the sort of thing where some are saying, this is a great idea, we must do it. And others say, and just how much are we going to get? And just on the issue of the super wealthy emigrating, it's the Zukman bill would include a 5-year hiatus afterwards, so that basically if you leave, you are still liable for the following 5 years after you leave. And if it came in now, they wouldn't have time to pick apart their fiscal lives. But also, history has shown us that not that many actually leave France. As Nina said, the threat is sometimes enough to simply kill the idea. And President Macron himself has said he doesn't believe it's a good idea, and he's afraid that some of the super wealthy would leave.
Hilesh, just come in on that. I'm struck by the phrase, money has no mast. So it means the rich have no loyalty or allegiance to a country or a flag. Their allegiance is to their bank balance. Do you think it matters to someone like Bernard Arnault if he's not living in France? Do you think reputationally he would be worried that his compatriots might be thinking, yeah, you were okay to be French when you had to pay taxes like the rest of us. When we asked you to pay more, suddenly you're popping up in Dubai or Switzerland or Milan?
Yeah, I think that's right to some extent. I think if you are in the public eye, if you are particularly high profile, I think it does matter actually. And I think, as was mentioned before, he did take, or he was starting the process of, moving to Belgium and then decided not to do so. So I think you'll get a small group of people where your allegiances to your country actually do really make a big difference, and because they will impact the bottom line, they'll impact your businesses, how you are perceived, and that's very important. But I think for a lot of people who are not in the public eye, who we don't know the names of, actually it really won't matter, and they will move, and they have been doing so, and they will continue to do so. As was said before, we've had, there seems to be a bit of a polarization across the world. You have some countries such as France and the UK most recently, just a month or two ago, where our Chancellor had been saying, well, maybe we should be implementing a wealth tax, although it has sort of backstepped from that as well. And then you have places like Italy, you have Greece, and other countries which are very much designing their tax systems to attract people. And they're taking bits of tax regimes from around the world to put them together. For example, Italy has a combination of sort of the UK's non-dom regime and the lump sum taxation that Switzerland famously has, to create a really quite attractive taxation system, which is gaining a lot of interest from people that I'm seeing. Portugal did do very well in the previous years when it had his 10-year regime, and again, sort of a flat tax. And I'm sure there'll be other countries also trying to attract the wealthy.
Thanks, Hilesh. Nina, there's a budget coming in November, of course, in the United Kingdom. I think we can expect tax rises in that as well. Do you find that as more countries are struggling financially, we're seeing chancellors and finance ministers desperately looking for anything that's going to drive up the tax take, and they're willing now to embrace something that not that long ago would have been seen as hugely radical?
As you heard there from Hilesh, you've got two trajectories, don't you? You've got some countries that think, well, look, we haven't tried one of these tax haven ruses before, and why don't we cash in for the next 10 years? Say, for instance, Portugal's just come through that cycle, Italy's entering that cycle. The UK arguably has been that cycle for much of the time I have been alive in London, because I've seen the British capital transform with wealth coming in from other parts of the world as, it benefited from a favourable treatment for ultra-high net worth individuals. The problem with this situation is that it's inherently a great thing for a short period of time. The problem is then a sort of a tax regime that favours the rich eventually is paid for. There's a sentiment, and this is the sentiment that Gabriel Zucman is really feeding into in France, is that eventually there becomes inequality as a result of it. And if you look at the French auditor, the Cour des Comptes, they actually took a look at how much Emmanuel Macron's tax breaks in France had affected the budget, and they reckoned that it could have affected it by about 50 billion over the years, perhaps even more, as some of the uber wealthy get more favourable tax treatment. So basically, on the one hand, as you were saying before, chancellors have to balance the books, but politically, people aren't there in places like France and also the UK. They're in a different period of the cycle in places like Portugal and Italy.
Ian, is there an argument from really hugely successful people like Bernard Arnault that I own companies, I have tens of thousands of employees, look at the tax contribution, not just from me and my family, but from all these people and all this wealth and success that he's generated, and he's been buying up luxury brands for decades in France. Does that argument have any credence when it comes to personal taxation?
I think the main criticism of a wealth tax, to be honest, is, yes, it will have a disincentive on someone like Bernard Arnault, who she says made a lot of people wealthy, a lot of his shareholders, which is all of us ultimately at the end of the day who own shares in LVMH via our pensions. The main problem with a wealth tax is it just doesn't raise enough money. Most countries have abandoned it over recent years. I mean, the Republic of Ireland did as long ago as 1978. More recently, the Dutch have dropped it, the Germans, most Scandinavian countries. There are only 3 countries in the world where it raises, where it really is meaningful, and that's Switzerland, Spain, and Norway. And if you look at Norway, case in point, Norway in 2022 alone lost 30 billionaires and multi-millionaires who were collectively worth around £43 billion. That's a big hit to the Norwegian exchequer. Now, Norway can live with that because of its oil and gas revenues, but these taxes really don't raise that much money in the great scheme of things.
So you think if the French push ahead with this, ultimately it will be damaging?
Yeah, of course it will be damaging. I mean, it will result. I mean, there are the reasons why you don't want a wealth tax. First of all, there's the capital flight, which we mentioned. People like Bernard Arnault will go. Secondly, it's actually administering it. And we've heard from Elaine about the kind of assets that might fall under a wealth tax. It's all sorts of things. And a lot of these people are asset rich and cash poor. So you're asking them potentially to disentangle their affairs where they've got equity in a private company. So basically the company would have to be sold or broken up. They might have it in property, which they may not necessarily want to sell. How do you value that? How do you value a work of art? So there's a huge administrative burden that goes with putting these wealth taxes into place. And as I say, ultimately, they don't raise much money. Now, if you take Spain, which has quite a broad sweeping wealth tax, it kicks in when you're worth 700,000 euros, which on the face of it is not an awful lot. Even there, it only raises 0.5% of Spanish GDP. If you're trying to raise big sums of money as a government, like the French are trying to do, like Rachel Reeves is doing here in the UK, ultimately, you've got to pull the big levers, VAT, national insurance, income tax.
Thanks, Ian. Elaine, to you, just in summary, so it's being described by critics as the work of a far left-wing activist in Gabriel Zucman. Do you think the French government will be brave enough or even desperate enough to embrace this?
Don't forget, we're on a new Prime Minister, Sébastien Lecornu. He's been handed the budget file that's been passed on from 3 other prime ministers since last July, and he's got to somehow make something work in order to bring some money into the French coffers. It's one of the things being looked at, but ultimately, as has been said, it's just not going to bring in quite enough, and it won't bring it in right away. It is much easier to raise taxes or raise VAT, as has already happened. But it's something that they definitely want to keep on the books for the moment because they are trying to bring in the Socialist Party. They're trying to get the unions on board. The unions in France remain very strong, and if they want to shut the country down, they're quite good at doing it. So it's a bit of a tightrope walk again for the new Prime Minister to see what can we actually do, what can we actually get, and is it worth the hassle?
Nina, final point to you. In Ireland, a few years back, very successful rock band living in Dublin, and they moved all their tax affairs to the Netherlands. Reputationally in Ireland, this is still brought up, that they didn't want to stay and pay their tax in their home country. Do you think someone like Bernard Arnault, 150 million euros, billion, will be bothered if he's not living in France?
I think what I would like to say is I think the French dynamic and situation is completely different to the one in the UK. In the UK, you had people leaving who are both British and people who had ported their huge billions and millions to the UK from elsewhere in the world. That isn't really the dynamic in France. The French business elite is the French business elite. Take Bernard Arnault, for instance. He inherited a property company. Yes, he was a very intelligent person, but he essentially turned it into a massive fashion empire that was, quote unquote, made in France. So I think their reputations are inextricably linked with French manufacturing, and also selling a product that is an elegant product that makes you feel better. It's an aspirational product. The big problem for somebody like Bernard Arnault is that he's selling aspirational French fashion, and you can't necessarily do that if you suddenly up sticks and go and live in somewhere like Belgium. So that's what's slightly different about the situation in France. And again, as we just heard before, it's going to affect a very small number of people. And really politically, what this government's trying to think about is the larger number of people who believe in one of the three founding values of France since the revolution, and that was égalité, equality.
Nina, thank you so much. Ian King as well, Hilesh Chavda and Elaine Cobbe in Paris. Thank you all. Remember, you can see more discussion and debate on our YouTube channel. Just search for Roundtable TRT World. But for now, from me, Enda Brady, and all the team here, goodbye and thank you for watching.